If we could just get you... Ladies and gentlemen, can I, if any of you have got spaces in your seating, can I ask you to move in, please? We need to get everybody seated quickly to get the official program underway. As soon as we have everybody seated and we're in business. Well, thank you, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this special event. The Chancellor of the University, Scott St John, will be presiding, and so as Vice-Chancellor, all I need to do is ask if you would please join me in welcoming the President of Ireland, Michael D. Higgins.
Kuku me mai ei. Ka tiki nā ati au ta kōtū koia te pauwhakairo ka tū ki te waite mata. Yo ku wairangitange. Ka te, ka whakakrōria tonu te tō tātou matu nui te rangi koe te ihi te wehi te tapu koe te mātāpuno ngā mea tapu katoa i te ao i te pō ka pīkau tonu nei. I wana tini mana ki tanga i tuku e i hora e ia ki runga i tēnā o tātou. Ka tangi ake rā ki ngā mate kei runga i a koutou ki ngā mate kei runga i a mātou. Ngā mate katoa e whai wāhi nei ki tēnei huiranga tiro o tātou, tēnei ka tangi ake ki a koutou, moi mai rā, oki mai rā koutou. Te hunga ora, e papi nei i a tātou te wairua hihiko, tēnā tātou. Hara mai rā e te aho tuarangi. Hara mai rā e te prihitini. Hara mai rā e ngā manuhiri, hara mai whakatau mai. Hara mai rā ki raro i te atarau o ngā maunga o tāmaki e tū whakahihi nei. Hara mai rā e te upoko o te kāwanatanga o te whenua motu hake, te ripaparika o airani, hara mai rā. Ko ruatahi ko tō huaranga tira e te whaia, te mārei kura, hara mai. E te minita mo ngā take ture, hara mai. Tā koutou ope koa hara mai nei, ki e nei motu e horo nei, hara mai, whakatau mai rā. Tēnei ko te whare wānanga o tāmaki makaurau. E tū whakaiti nei runga ngā papataka hanga o Ngāti Whātua e whakatau nei, e mihi nei, e kranga nei ki a koutou, hara mai, whakatau mai. Whakatau mai rā i runga i te hitoria, i wainga, i ngā whenua e rua nei. New Tirini, Aotearoa, te whenua o Airani, te mano hunga no tērā whenua i haere mai ki te noho ki runga i nei whenua, tēnei ka whakamahara kei te rā nei. O tātou kara e rua nei, e tū nei, tērā o New Tirini, tērā o te ripaparaka o Airani, tēnei ka mihi. Nā reira hara mai, whakatau nei. E papi ana rā te honore, te koa te kite nei i a koutou, no reira tēnā koutou katoa. Your Excellency, Mr. President, Your Excellency, Mrs. Higgins, Minister Flanagan, and your delegation, the University welcomes you on behalf of the Mana Whenua, the tribe which has customary dominion over Tāmaki Makaurau, the city of Auckland, Ngāti Whātua. We welcome you to the city with the largest Pacific population in the world. We welcome you to New Zealand's most diverse city. and we welcome you to New Zealand's largest and most diverse university. We welcome you in the spirit of the shared history between our two great nations. The Republic of Ireland has deep roots in the historical garden of Aotearoa, New Zealand, and we celebrate those today. We welcome you remembering the interactions between the Maori people and Irish settlers in New Zealand's colonial history. Some of those interactions blossomed into unions and marriages. Some of them evolved into less formal unions, but in spite of that, many thousands of Maori, many generations later, are proud to claim Irish heritage. When we think of such characters present in the time of our colonial history, names such as that of Haki Marmon, Jack Marmon, Cannibal Jack, the tattooed Irishman who was befriended by the Ngāpuhi people come to mind. Judge Frederick Manning of the Hokianga, who married a northern Maori woman, and Father James MacDonald, the famous Catholic missionary who converted many Maori in the early 1800s to the Catholic faith. Many of us are proud to be of both Maori and Irish heritage. I am one, and as the saying goes among my family, one side is very fond of a little tipple, the other side doesn't know when to stop. For the last 30 years, Maori and Irish linguists and scholars have collaborated to share strategies for the resurrection and renaissance of our two Indigenous languages. When President Eamon de Valera visited here in 1948, he attracted crowds of thousands of interested New Zealanders of Irish descent. When Mary Robinson visited, she planted a tree in commemoration of Kate Shepherd in 1993 in the year of New Zealand suffrage. And when Patrick Hillary visited in the 1980s, he paid a visit to the late Maori Queen Te Atai Rangikahu at her palace at Tūranga Waiwai Marae. With our fondness for culture, music, sport, the very high value we place on diversity and equality, it is no wonder that when New Zealanders think to Ireland, they think of her as a friend and as a relative. They think of her with much affection and with much joy. Therefore, our dear friends, Your Excellencies, President Higgins, Mrs. Higgins, Minister Flanagan, may you experience much joy while you are here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and we welcome you with warm and loving hearts. Your Excellency, President Higgins, in your lifetime you have received many awards, the Order of the Clans of Ireland being one. Our cheeky Australian relatives took the opportunity to bestow on you an honorary doctorate in Perth. Following your address to us, Mr. Jim Peters, the Pro-Vice Chancellor Maori, will present to you the Taonga Pounamu, the symbolically carved greenstone pendants which will link you to this earth, we hope, for eternity, symbolic of the eternal relationship which our two nations enjoy. May you and your delegation experience much peace, grace and joy in a country that knows you. You've come here to forge stronger diplomatic relationships between our two countries, so in that spirit we welcome you warmly. Nō reire te rangatira haramai, e te māreikura haramai, e te minita haramai. E ngā rangatira ko haramai tahi me te tō tātou rangatira haramai rā whakatau mai. E te matua e Stuart, e te tumuaki, e te matua e Jim, huri tō tātou whare. Irish cousins mā, tēnā tātou, kia ora mai rā tātou katoa.
Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, my name is Scott St John, and as Chancellor of the University of Auckland, it is my great pleasure to add my voice to that outstanding welcome to our guests today. Most particularly, we welcome on the occasion of this state visit to New Zealand the President of Ireland, Michael D. Higgins, and his wife, Sabina Higgins. There are an estimated 13,000 Irish citizens living in New Zealand, and it is wonderful to see so many of you here today, joining our students, staff and supporters on this important occasion. It is most appropriate that we are today gathered on the university campus. As a former lecturer in political science and sociology at the National University of Ireland, Galway, and in the United States, President Higgins has displayed a lifelong commitment to the support of education and the arts. Michael D. Higgins is also a writer and a poet, contributing to many books covering diverse aspects of Irish politics, sociology, history, and culture. He has published 2 collections of essays, Causes for Concern, Irish Politics, Culture and Society, and Renewing the Republic. He has also published 4 collections of poetry, The Betrayal, The Season of Fire, An Arid Season, and New and Selected Poems. A passionate political voice and statesman, human rights advocate, promoter of inclusive citizenship, and champion of creativity within Irish society, Michael D. Higgins has previously served at many levels of public life in Ireland, including as Ireland's First Minister of Arts, Culture and the Gaeltacht. I've been working on that. Yes. And Mrs. Higgins, thank you for your assistance with that matter. Throughout his life, Michael D. Higgins has campaigned for human rights and for the promotion of peace and democracy in Ireland and in many other parts of the world, from Nicaragua to Chile to Cambodia, Iraq and Somalia. In 1992, he was the first recipient of the Sean McBride Peace Prize from the International Peace Bureau in Helsinki in recognition of his work for peace and justice in many parts of the world. And on the 11th of November in 2011, he was inaugurated as the 9th President of Ireland. We're honoured today to have President Higgins visiting the University of Auckland and delivering an address to our students, staff, supporters and members of the wider public. Having read a number of your speeches, as I mentioned a little earlier, I'm thrilled to hear that today you'll be addressing the topic Ireland and New Zealand, some origins and prospects of 2 nations who share so many experiences and interests, which is so true. Ladies and gentlemen, please join with me in welcoming the President of Ireland, Michael D. Higgins, to deliver his address.
Chancellor, last Chancellor, a Vicklane is a green Ushla. En gate al Churches Minla Mawikas lat, a Chancellor, as the Ocliasa, the Sokohire and Firkin Folcher, a Vormehits and either Winter Dokasak and Quitshot and down. Gwillicha Gomorra on made the Gurtu, Agus and Changawal Luatu, either Winter Neherin, is Winter New Helen. Is Gwim Gagrag, Spanactor, the winter, it's on the Imis, it's on the Tollegiact, is Berbanach. May I say, Vice Chancellor, thank you for your kind introduction this evening. And I just have said in my own language, I represented for a great number of years the largest number of those who spoke the Irish language as their first language in Galway West, Galway here, and in the Aran Islands. And indeed, I do recall very clearly what my predecessor, Emma de Valera, said when he came here. And today I have to tell you our work continues in promoting the use of the Irish language, which is used in the home of the President almost every day. I do thank you for the warmth and depth of the invitation and welcome to the land of which your people were the first settlers and which the people the first arrivals, the people their land, both in terms of the spiritual significance of it and both in terms also of the way in which you are negotiating the present and the future in full consciousness of the rich traditions that New Zealand has the great advantage of sharing. It is an honour to address this august institution and to see so many university students and staff, and particularly to university, which has contributed so much and is continuing to contribute so much to the social, cultural and intellectual life of New Zealand. And by the way, before I say anything else, my publisher would want to say, my last book last year, When Ideas Matter, is in your bookshops. As a former university teacher, I did indeed teach sociology and political science. It is a very great pleasure at any time to return to university. Universities are enormously important as communities of ideas and communities of scholarship. And it's a very particular pleasure to have been asked to address a university from which one of the great literary movements of New Zealand emerged. It had as its image an image that many literary revivals and Renaissance movements shared. Indeed, it's an image that sits on top of a monument outside the gate of Orosanutru, the home of the President of Ireland. I refer to the publication of that short-lived but seminal literary journal, Phoenix, in whose pages were first published the words of Alan Carnhow, Rex Fairburn, Ronald Mason, and Charles Brash, among others. And they used words that were both ambitious and inclusive, and words that must surely ring from the 1930s, the difficult 1930s, through to the decades of today. They wrote as manifesto for their journal, "We are hungry for the words that shall allow us these islands and ourselves, that will show us and that shall give us a home in thought." A home in thought. I recall reflecting on these powerful words, their demand as they are for a public culture and a space for culture, as I prepared for my very first visit to New Zealand in 1999. We are hungry for the words that shall show us these islands and ourselves, that shall give us a home in thought. They were very relevant then, because as a former Minister for Arts, Culture and the Gaeltacht in Ireland, and President of the Council of Culture Ministers of the European Union in 1996, during the Irish presidency of the European Union, I had been very engaged in matters of cultural policy, and I had been invited to address a symposium organised by the Broadcasting Commission and the Institute of Public Policy Studies in Wellington to speak on the importance of creativity, cloriocht, as we say in Irish, and in particular the future of public service broadcasting. On that occasion, I spoke, based on my experiences in Ireland, of the crucial importance and the potential of public broadcasting as an invitation to the citizen to experience the timeless, the universal, the unimagined. Remember Lord Reid's phrase, "a nation talking to itself," and as though it is providing a rich source of creativity, beginning to be abused as a term at the time. I spoke too of the dangers of what was then emerging and indeed strengthening as a perspective, which saw broadcasting as something lesser, as merely a production space for a commodified and homogenized entertainment. I reminded my audience on that occasion of the title of Raymond Williams' last great public lecture, "Be the Arrow, Not the Target," with its powerful advocacy for active participatory culture as an alternative to the passive consumption of homogenized product, the outcome often of monopolized production and indeed distorted distribution practices. So it is a privilege for me to return to this great country now, Maruk Tránahéireann as President of Ireland, and I'm grateful for the invitation to address you this afternoon. I was fascinated to learn of the early influence of Irish migrants, as we have just heard. The influence of Irish migrants indeed on the development of this university itself. Its establishment in 1882 owed much to the efforts of George Morris O'Rourke, the son of an Irish Anglican parson from County Galway, who would go on to become Speaker of the House of Representatives and Chairman of the Council of this university. As is the case with many of the Antipodean universities, migrant Irish scholars exerted a significant intellectual influence in those early years. If I were, as a former teacher of sociology, to single out one, it would be Hutchison Macaulay Posnet, author of what is considered by many as one of the foundational texts in the sociology of literature. He was, like many Irish lawyers of his generation, schooled in the comparative jurisprudence of Henry Maine, a method which he extended to the study of literature and political economy. His first work, The Historical Method in Ethics, Jurisprudence and Political Economy, encompassed a critique of the classical political economy of his day, a matter which remains of enduring interest to me. Indeed, I suggest to you, students and intellectuals, to ask the question, where in what journal today would you find all those terms sitting in the same title? The Historical Method in Ethics, Jurisprudence and Political Economy. The influence of Irish scholars and politicians, of course, is but one small strand of a longer and enduring connection between New Zealand and Ireland. In the decade prior and immediately following the Treaty of Waitangi, many of the Irish who came to these shores were migrants, sometimes escaped or time-expired convicts from the Peelin colonies across the Tasman, seeking to make, and very often in this city, a new life in the rough and tumble trades of whaling, sealing, and timber cutting. It was from such a milieu, for example, that the Sydney-born Irish father of the Maori politician and government minister, James Carroll, emerged. Others were colonial administrators and soldiers who came to serve here during the New Zealand Wars. The best known, perhaps, is the Irish administrators, maybe William Hobson, the naval commander from County Waterford and first governor of New Zealand, who gave this city its name and drafted the Treaty of Waitangi. In those early years, the pattern of Irish settlement was concentrated here on the North Island rather than the South Island, which was then developing according to the template of that champion of what was called systemic colonization, Edward Gibbon Wakefield. For despite the involvement of John Robert Godley and James Edward Fitzgerald, both Anglo-Irish colonial enthusiasts, the enterprise of the New Zealand Company had very few places for Irish migrants or Irish colonial intellectuals. It was the Otago gold rush of 1861 that brought the first large influx of Irish migrants, miners, who had first sought their fortune in Ballarat and Bendigo, where alluvial deposits were now exhausted. And 49ers, too, came from across the Pacific Ocean, where gold fever had slowly given way to the imposition of the rule of law by the new state of California. I recall as a sociologist teaching the words of Josiah Strong about the discord which they addressed. God created man in a garden. The city is the result of the fall. The impact of such a wave is clearly visible when one compares the census returns. In 1861, on the cusp of discoveries at the Tuapeka and Waipori fields, the Irish-born population numbered 8,831. Just 3 years later, there were 20,317 Irish-born living in New Zealand. The Irish population in New Zealand had doubled. It would be inappropriate for me also to ignore a fundamental fact for that year. That is the year when there is a devastating loss in the Maori population. And it is then the great gap between settlers and Maori begins to emerge in its darkest form. As Angela McCarthy, Jock Phillips and Terry Hearn have shown in their research, new arrivals from Ireland followed through what scholars of migration have referred to as a process of chain migration. That is, one person following another from families and from friendship networks. As Irish people in New Zealand persuaded and through nomination schemes established by the provinces of the young colony, secured the subsidised passage of their friends and family members. This process accelerated rapidly in the 1870s under the influence of the ambitious assisted passage scheme championed by Jules Vogel. It is at this stage as well there is a specific request for 1,300 females to head to this city here. This vast project of the early entrepreneurial state dramatically expanded the possibility for nomination and extended the potential of direct recruitment of new colonists from Ireland, which had hitherto been an unexplored possibility. In some provinces still beholden to the legacies of colonial companies, such as the Canterbury Association. Indeed, it was George Morris O'Rourke, who was Minister for Immigration, ensured an increase in the number of recruiting agencies dispatched to Ireland. The Irish-born population then peaked at 51,406 on the cusp of the Long Depression in 1886. It would slowly decline thereafter, as those with Irish ancestors gradually integrated in what would become Pakeha society. The new Irish arrivals of the 1860s and 70s were predominantly small farmers and rural labourers, men and women who had grown up in an agrarian society, as the historian Donald Atkinson has noted. They also, for example, shifted the concentration of the Irish presence to the South Island, to Canterbury, where Irish men fulfilled the same role as they would in the United States, Irish navvies building the roads, bridges and railways of the rapidly expanding province, and where Irish women were often engaged as domestic servants. On the west coast, towns like Hokitika, a booming gold rush town, developed for a time a distinctive Irish identity, with indeed pubs and taverns named after familiar Irish heroes and patriots. The Irish arrivals participated too, along with other migrants who came to this land, in the creation of what really was a laboratory of social experiment, for which the new democracy of New Zealand would become noted. If there was a distinctive Irish contribution to a country famed for its progressive legislation, it was perhaps, I suggest, a certain sense of recoil from and an ambition to transcend what was perceived by them to be an oppressive colonial mindset, inappropriate for the new setting in which they found themselves. This was deeply understandable, given the Irish experience of the effects of oppression and injustice and exclusion from all opportunities that were foreclosed by cultural assumptions, among other measures, as to their inferiority, exclusion on religious grounds, and an unjust political economy. They were, however, perhaps moved too by an impulse to imagine a new world that could be created with freer institutional possibilities in the southern oceans. In the imperial world of the 19th century, this was demonstrated by an unusual parallel, and indeed maybe it is a contradiction, as the matter of land reform and land redistribution in New Zealand became inextricably linked in the eyes of the colonists with the importance of learning from the failures of landlordism in Ireland. 8,000 main landlords with several agents in between, governing a huge state of poverty in which 1 million people would die while food was being exported and 2 million forced into exile. A people really submitted to the dictates of a hegemonic economic theory, which was actually being debated, sometimes referred to indeed as an act of God. Indeed, one distinguished economist, the founder of one of the Australian universities, suggested that the Irish people were dying because they didn't understand economics. In 1881, Robert Stout, a Scottish immigrant born on the Shetland Islands, and a future premier, published an interesting pamphlet, The Irish Question and Its Lessons for Colonists, advocating the use of the then novel land tax as a mechanism to provide land to the small proprietor and prevent New Zealand from becoming an antipodean replica of the Irish social structure. As I have said, a country of great landed estates, numerous toiling tenant farmers, and an expanding, grinding poverty that would have devastating consequences. In the same year, 1881, John Balance, the eldest son of an Irish tenant farmer and future Premier, attended a mass meeting in Wellington in support of the Irish National Land League, which had been established in Ireland 3 years earlier in County Mayo, 1979. In the words of its founding resolutions, it was aimed at the obtaining of the ownership of the soil by the occupiers. When the leader of the Irish National Land League, Michael Davitt, some years later, he toured New Zealand in 1896, he found here a reflection of what he felt were the most advanced ideas of his age, many of which he had advocated in Ireland: a progressive land tax, land redistribution, a determination to ensure that older people were ensured an income in old age, a faith in the pursuit of the public good, and a combination of a definition of welfare that would include those who worked on the land and those who worked in the cities and the factories. He was, in fact, advocating legislation to ensure that Labour, for example, secured a fairer share of the proceeds of growth. And he saw in this a recognition and vindication of a public world that he saw as possible, uniting the efforts, as I have said, of land and labour. He attributed these policies he saw as successful to the influence of Balance and his lieutenant, John Mackenzie, who of course had witnessed island clearances as a young boy. And this is how Davitt wrote: an Irish Premier of New Zealand, aided chiefly by a Celtic Highlander, both of whom knew something of Irish and Scottish landlordism, instrumental a few years ago in moulding the present land laws of the colony on the broad, just and rational principle of the land of a country for the people of the country, and not for any class. We are reminded by such words that it was impossible to ignore the role that the clearances, the enclosures, had in creating the huge numbers of vagrants whose crimes would be used to fill the colonies with those transported in humiliating and degrading conditions. And as to dispossession in the country he was visiting, Michael Davitt would also write of the Maori landleaguers and of Te Whiti, and of how they, as he put it, were beaten by overwhelming forces, but the principle underlying their brave struggle was not crushed. If Ireland demonstrated to New Zealanders then an imposed destiny that was to be averted for Irish observers such as Davitt, New Zealand in its turn showed by its willingness to experiment, to engage in quite new forms of thought and action, and to challenge and overturn the failing orthodoxies of the old world, and it was thus indicating, he thought, an alternative pathway to the future. And indeed, according parity of esteem, going beyond simply recognizing differences of culture, doing that, echoing that extra mile, that is a real achievement to be celebrated in the contemporary political space. Such values and impulses are surely needed too, now more than ever, for we need at global, national, and international level a morally informed sense of the importance of human dignity, a scholarship that is able to absorb the impulses of the human street and the human spirit, that is able to craft alternative theoretical and policy models that can integrate a moral intent in ethics, ecology, and economics. Good scholarship is inclusive scholarship. And I suggest that we need to reframe, for example, economics as political economy in such a fashion as will generate responsibility, as will allow transparent participatory policy formation, and give us the capacity to reconnect with our publics and their best ethical intent. There is much that we in Ireland can continue to learn from New Zealand, like Davitt, and perhaps much we may learn anew and rediscover together as we face the great challenges of coming decades, from which neither of us must shirk our responsibilities. The urgency for just and sustainable development, the necessity to address the causes and consequences of climate change, the prevention and resolution of conflicts, both ancient and new, the imperative to welcome those fleeing war, persecution, and famine, the ever-present threat of nuclear weapons, and the growing inequalities in wealth, income, and opportunity, and their contemporary threat to social cohesion in so many parts of the world. For citizens of Ireland and citizens of New Zealand, given our shared characteristics and what, as I've suggested, are our shared values, I believe there is so much we can continue to achieve together. We are both small countries in terms of population, but countries who value our democratic traditions and who seek to be authentic in our commitment to international institutions, a commitment expressed best, perhaps, by our shared abhorrence of the threat posed by nuclear weapons. It was the Irish representative at the General Assembly of the United Nations who first proposed in 1959 a resolution that would lead to the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, which has been, from 1968 up to this year, the primary international legal instrument designed to prevent the dissemination of nuclear weapons and to achieve their disarmament. The virtues required for this achievement were certainly tact, tenacity, and a quiet and stubborn persistence. And as we look forward, what a great gift to humanity and to present and future generations it would be if, as was originally committed, a reduction in nuclear missiles and their eventual elimination was achieved for humanity. New Zealanders can be proud, too, of those virtues I have mentioned, as they recall a steadfast and courageous of a kind that were required to refuse the presence of the USS Buchanan and secure New Zealand's status as a nuclear-free nation. Namely, courage, bravery, and in the face of the oblique and sometimes open hostility of the two nuclear-armed states of the day. Fortitude was needed, and it was shown. And fortitude is surely the word that comes to mind when one thinks and recalls the shocking bombing in July 1985 of the Rainbow Warrior, not far from here in Auckland Harbour. I think that many small nations, in the face of such intimidation, might have sought some kind of discreet compromise. It is rare in international relations to find what was an inspiring display of moral clarity. In June of this year, our two countries, in cooperation again with many others, co-sponsored the General Assembly resolution mandating the convention of a new United Nations conference to negotiate a new treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. This treaty, adopted in June and opened for formal signature last month, prohibits the development, testing, production, stockpiling, stationing, transfer, use and threat of use of nuclear weapons. It represents the most widespread acceptance of the total threat to humanity posed by nuclear weapons. Some have decried this recent treaty, signed by so many members of the United Nations, as being without merit, I quote. They have suggested that it lacks force because it does not carry the approval of those who insist on continuing to possess nuclear weapons. Now let us be very clear what these critics are suggesting. It is no more and no less than claiming the right to hold what is a veto for the existing nuclear-armed states on policy making in this area. Such a view simply echoes what is already an abuse of veto-holding permanent members of the Security Council of the United Nations. Our mutual faith and trust in multilateral institutions, Ireland and New Zealand, and the cooperation between nation-states finds expression in our long-standing commitment as well to the contribution of personnel to United Nations peacekeeping activities. Indeed, may I suggest that the principles that have underpinned peacekeeping for 6 decades, the requirement for consent of the main parties to the conflict, to implement the United Nations mandate without fear or favour, and the non-use of force except in self-defence, and defence of the mandate, are more apposite to the sensibility of smaller nations such as ours. And then as to some current challenges, many of which we share and will share, our 2 island nations have been endowed by nature with a temperate climate, enabling a kind of pastoral agriculture that is to some degree a product of past dependency, reflecting our history as suppliers of primary products, in our case, to Britain. The entry of Britain and Ireland into the European Economic Community with its common agriculture policy was a significant change for both of us, but with differing consequences. The structure and success of our agricultural industries brings with it, of course, a unique challenge for both our countries in the battle against climate change. Agriculture accounts for nearly 1/3 of Ireland's greenhouse gas emissions, and I understand somewhat more here in New Zealand, which makes both of us outliers when compared to the other industrialized countries who participated in the first commitment period under the Kyoto Protocol of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. We have both adopted emissions trading schemes as a policy measure to reduce fossil fuel emissions. These schemes exclude the emissions generated by pastoral farming, which, due to our unique emissions profile, will require distinctive, novel, and sometimes difficult policy measures to be directed to dairy and beef farming, even as the temptation is now to increase our national herds to meet rising world demand. We should not and must not underestimate the depth or nature of this task. The recalibration of our agricultural industry to meet obligations we have accepted by international treaty is an obligation we must, and which I believe we can meet. We can enlist the benefits of science and technology, but it will also require being resolute in the tough decisions we may need to take and for which we must educate our publics. The agreement signed at the Paris Climate Conference in December 2015 was an enormous achievement, representing an important moral milestone, as imperfect as it may be, in recognizing the demands of climate justice and what is the imperative for survival for so many people in this century, particularly in the developing world. The decarbonization of our societies demanded by the pledge to pursue efforts to limit the global temperature increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels will not be easy, nor can it be made without sacrifice. It will require the of all members of our society engaged in the production, distribution, consumption, and exchange of agricultural products to ensure that our countries can contribute to the effort truly required under the Paris Climate Accord. Yes, it will require new ideas, skills, and methods, the opening of new frontiers of science and technology, a renewed commitment to the exchange of technical expertise, and may I suggest the recollection, too, of much of the wisdom of ancient methods, balances, and symmetries of ecological management of ancient societies. The agreement of the Sustainable Development Goals in New York in September of 2015 constitutes what has the potential to be as important an achievement as the Paris Climate Accord. Over 193 states resolved to end poverty and hunger, combat inequalities in economic income and opportunity, to build peaceful, just, and inclusive societies, and to create conditions for a shared prosperity. We have used this language before, but as we face 2050, with 24% of the young people under 21 years of age that will be on the continent of Africa, 40% of the young people under 21, 24% of the total population of the planet. Can we face what is really a great opportunity with our existing models of economic development? The answer, of course, is no. And therefore we should consider in universities like this, as I have said, in other universities, how we can enable the benefits and consequences of science and technology to leap over borders, not wait, if you like, to be the tail end of investment from existing structures internationally, locate themselves in the continent of expanding population and create new possibilities. We must not, I believe, be dislodged or dissuaded from these objectives that I have mentioned, no matter how powerful, that seek to eschew the global common good in the service of narrow sectional interests. There will always be those who will make the case for what they regard as the tyranny of the contemporary sectional interests that will defeat, if you like, the longer-term common goals. Tomorrow, I will have the great honour, too, to visit the Waitangi Treaty grounds. And I could not help but be put in mind of our own treaty to the Good Friday Agreement in Ireland, the cornerstone of a peace process which demands our continual attention in Northern Ireland. In both cases, it is when we see these treaties as living treaties, as processes towards the achievement of a shared dignity of recognized differences and belief in the possibilities of the future, that we can in fact see what they can deliver most for us. The suggestion that indivisibility may not be the sole defining characteristic of sovereignty imagined by Thomas Hobbes and Jean Bodin, but that sovereignty may be instead a matter of perpetual renegotiation and debate, something shared, carried out in a democratic, respectful and inclusive spirit, is both profound and liberating, especially when it is imagined in practice. I've spoken in other places of the necessary courtesies of discourse, the complex and intricate relationships between peoples embodied in these respective agreements that I've mentioned. They require a constant commitment to ensure that they remain living documents capable of achieving the full promise of their possibilities. Both our nations are small, open economies, highly open to world markets, yet also because of that very openness vulnerable to changes in international commodity prices, the structure of global value chains, and the sudden shifts and shocks to capital and financial flows. The forms of both capital and the nature of their flows have changed radically in the recent decades of deregulation. They have created what I suggest is a dystopia. I also have found in recent years been speaking on the issues of indigeneity, and nowhere have I seen a more blatant disregard for international law than on the part of certain corporations who have said to indigenous communities defending themselves against the poison in their waters, we will fight this case until hell freezes over and then on the ice. I have seen, in fact, where in countries like Ecuador, peasant communities have been faced with an army of lawyers, themselves, remember, products of universities, who have in fact said that they will follow such a set of practices, defeating, this is what I mean by what I have said earlier, by restoring a moral context to these subjects, which some of us have had the privilege of teaching. The economic forces I refer to are not natural phenomena, and neither are they inevitabilities. They are the product of negotiated institutional design and public policy. And concerted action by states acting in cooperation with each other can, as they have in the past, constrain, control, and bind such forces in the service of the common good. But it requires regulation. It is in the capital flows that are outside regulation, that are not and never were available for productive use, that the greatest uncertainties in global conditions for economies large and small are so. As we have learned in Ireland, where our productive economy stayed strong in 2007 to 12, but the speculative consequences were had to be visited on our people. The economics of the future It will, I believe, inevitably deal with the challenges of building and securing social cohesion. More equal societies, as one study after another shows, in every part of the world, more equal societies are healthier societies. Societies with deep inequalities are neither viable in terms of a stable, cohesive citizenship, nor are they healthy societies. Wild capital can yield short-term benefits for the few, but be destructive for the many. And the forms of capital which prevail within an economy, they're not the same as each other in terms of their consequences in any part of the globe. We need then to privilege productive capital flows that lead to investment strategies that are socially accountable, job-creating, sustainable. And this requires allowing economies and the societies which they serve to level up. And may I repeat, we must reject the suggestion that there is anything inevitable about the practices of any dominating hegemon in terms of international trade. This has been manifested most recently in the creation of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, to which New Zealand has already subscribed and of which Ireland is now a member. If these measures are to be at their best, such institutions must channel flows of capital that will enhance the long-run economic growth potential of developing countries and finance sustainable and sustained development. And yet in this, the 10th year since the global financial crisis, the broader international financial architecture has yielded only most painfully and gradually to change. We should question whether the institutions charged with regulating global flows of capital and finance have sufficient resources, the appropriate capacity, and most importantly, the agreed mandate that is necessary to achieve the economic and social objectives to which we are committed. There have been small, revelatory, but welcome changes in the advices offered by the International Monetary Fund on matters of fiscal policy and the control of movements of capital, and the report of the Commission on Global Poverty, established by the World Bank, which recommended broadening the concept of poverty to include non-monetary measures of deprivation, all welcome. But we must ask, as many in the global street are ever more vociferously are now asking, and most painfully experiencing, as to whether some of the ideas which led to the global financial crisis still underpin global policy. Those who still believe that private financial markets will allocate resources to their best, most efficient use, and must be allowed to do so without regulation, they have not gone away. And those that serve them are back on bonuses. And the universities that are producing the rationalization for such bonuses are still in business. I think taking into account the necessity for sustainable and just development, we may well ask, on behalf of whose and which interests do they speak and act, these international institutions? May I suggest that the great matters before us in the coming decade cannot be met with the ideas or assumptions of what are now failing. Failed paradigms of a less than democratic, often authoritarian, frequently patriarchal past. Our new challenges in new circumstances must be addressed drawing on the best of the new morally engaged scholarship that values social cohesion. And this is something we must pursue collectively at a global level with the same vigor and spirit with which our two countries have addressed the threat of a nuclear Armageddon. Can we, in these difficult times, I ask, summon again the same openness, admiration for new ideas, and willingness to break with old orthodoxies that Michael Davitt noted here in this country a century ago? Can we bring the same determination to share, to debate, to contest, and to constantly renegotiate sovereignty in a democratic manner shown by the peoples of Ireland and New Zealand have shown in these recent years? Can we bring the same moral clarity and ethical vision, the same courage and fortitude, the same willingness to confront unaccountable power that has been shown by the peoples of this country in declaring and enforcing a nuclear-free zone? Can we bring this freshness of thought to matters economic internationally? I ask this question of both of our peoples. How we answer such questions will determine whether we can confront and overcome the challenges of a new century. It is essential in all of this that we retain our optimism, the necessary courtesies of ethical discourse, I suggest, our will, but a good beginning might be to combine our efforts in achieving for our peoples what is little less than a new literacy on economic and fiscal matter. And all of this brings me back to that first paper in New Zealand in 1999, which was to a conference debating how we might, by defending public service broadcasting, secure and deepen the public world. That struggle continues in new conditions. And I suggest that we must not merely hope, we must imagine, we must change, and we must achieve. Garamila mahagiasok dervuja, maroktra hen is milam gagra, agus banach de guire dantauki, godeshiv slon, barbana. Thank you so much for listening.
Ladies and gentlemen, President Higgins has kindly consented to take some questions from the floor. So I believe there are some microphones. Yes, in fact, I can see them now out there in the audience. So if you have a question, if you could raise your hand and we will do our best to find you. Sir.
Yes, President Higgins. Yes, thank you, President Higgins. In 1923, when the Irish Free State had been formed, they introduced Gaelic as a compulsory subject in schools. I'd be interested if that turned out to be a help or a hindrance to the Gaelic language. You'll understand I'm a Maori language student, although far from fluent.
It's a very good question. And I think that what you need to think about, in Irish we call it Gaeilge Éigeantach, compulsory Irish. And the debate about compulsory Irish is a very important one. Just to give you context, I think that the cultural revival movement of the late 19th century is very, very important in understanding the formation of the new Irish state. It's a moment of intense cultural activity with men and women writing, publishing pamphlets, exchanging essays, producing works. This is the Irish revival, roughly from about 1890 to 1910 is its intense period. Why was it said? There is a very famous essay by the first president of Ireland, Douglas the Heather, on replacing English with Irish. You have to understand what lay behind Creevan and Douglas the Hyde's essay. English had been imposed on Ireland in a number of ways. At one time, you wore a stick around your neck and you put a notch in it every time you used an Irish word. And when you went to school the following day, you were punished on the basis of the number of marks on the stick. And then again, I remember as well, even in my time when I was in active politics, people referred to the Irish language, people referred to English as what you needed for the boat. What you needed for the boat, because our people had to learn English to go abroad because of the migrants. So that's the background why people said then we will restore in many ways it created a mythology that suited they'd drawn from ancient times and that you could in fact put it into place and so on. I think myself that it was a mistake I think that the essay might have been, I understand how it came to be written, but I don't agree with it. For the very reason Hyde himself, for example, spoke 5 languages, including he was very influenced by Hebrew and how it had been brought back. But he also spoke, his wife was German, he spoke at least 5 that I know of. So then what happened then, I think, was very interesting. At one stage, another of my predecessors, I think it's in Eamon de Valera's time as Prime Minister, as Taoiseach, we would say, a number of all the state servants changed their names into Irish, and as if that was going to revive the subject. I actually wrote a poem about that one time called Revivalist, which I couldn't publish while I was Minister for Arts, Culture and the Gaeltacht. But you then move on, and where are we now? Our issue now is not basic knowledge, because it is taught in all the primary schools, which I think is very good. You also have some schools at second level, which are all Irish. They teach all the subjects through Irish. I myself would have learned Latin and Greek, for example, through Irish, and all of the subjects at different stages. And then I'm not a native speaker, but when I was in England, there's a gap in my use of Irish. When I was in America, the same. But I represented my constituents, which are about 30% at one stage. Irish was their first language every day. And I was speaking a radio in a Gaeltacht in the morning at 8 o'clock, and also I'm the minister responsible for the establishment of the Irish television service. Teaching Cahar now, it is Rad Television Gaeilge. All of this, what I'm really saying is, I'm in favour of Maragutme, I'll say it in Irish first because it's easier for me. Maragutme kind of undini valid and changa, encouraging people, bringing people to the language rather than forcing it. And let us say the language, the television service that I established between 93 and 97, which is now going strong. The reason was I said, give the language a second chance, because they had been taught in a rather authoritarian way in some occasions, and people had a bad experience. So therefore I would say, give it another chance. So you would see everything in Irish, you see the subtext in English and so forth. And in many ways, if you're asking me, it's a long answer I've given to your question, but it was worth it, I think, to answer you properly. And that is, if you said to me, you must encourage and lure people to the language, make the language attractive. The language also needn't stand for every antiquated authoritarian idea that was ever dreamed up and imagined. The ancient Irish were people, for example, who, in relation to if you were unhappy in your marriage, you walked several times around your partner and you said, I'm off. So the point about it is that the language is never, unfortunately at different times, I do remember people foisted onto the language attitudes that really had nothing to do with the essential Irish spirit. It is a language of life, and thankfully it's been spoken more and more and more by young people. And I am really pleased to see the significance that is given to the Maori culture and to the fact that the welcome in the public space. It's in the public space it must be recognised, and that's good.
So as Minister, you used to have the culture portfolio, and you know, nowadays we see the kind of development of a transnational or regional identity, such as the European identity. How do you see as the kind of European identity, how does that interplay with, say, the Irish or other national identities in your view?
I think, again, another wonderful question in a way, because this is what I mean by the European street. Noted that I quoted Raymond Williams' article, "Be the arrow, not the target." That is for participatory, active culture rather than being a passive consumer of homogenized product. I remember the French President Mitterrand once said that some of the finest films in the world were made in the United States, but it was unreasonable to suggest that all films of the world that would be seen by Europeans would come from a small corner of the west coast of the United States. And I myself, as Culture Minister, had this debate with Jack Valenti and others. And I used to remind him, for example, of the new wonderful black film directors in Harlem and places like that, which, because he represented West Coast filmmaking, heterogeneity is an essential part. There is what would a European culture be like? It would be informed by some basic ideas in relation to democracy, in relation to discourse. I think very often what I think should have happened, remember now about the European Union in a way, it didn't deal with culture in the founding treaties. First of all, it had a bad experience with the abuse of culture as an ocean through fascism. It also assumed that the Council of Europe would deal with culture. And then a number of times as it came up when I myself was attending council meetings, people thought the culture was something you should keep close to education at home. So therefore it was an ideal matter for subsidiarity. What I think people need to do what is very, very wonderful would be the idea that there are core values in relation to equality, rights, participation, gender equality, respect for the environment. We in Ireland gained from our membership of the European Union in relation to equality of men and women, in relation to the environment, in relation to fair wages, all of this. But the values got lost in a way, because I think the Lisbon Treaty, when you look at the history of the treaties, remember it had two great principles, competitiveness and cohesion. Cohesion got lost along the way, in my view. And thus, I think that at the time of the crisis recently, it was something very un-European to hear some nations speaking of other nations with language that was simply not the language of a union. I had discussed this with the President of Italy. I've discussed it with heads of state in other countries in Europe. And we are all of the same mind, that the language wasn't generous. And therefore, I think as well, it is called spade spade. If you're talking about a union, you're talking about all of the members sharing the possibilities going forward together. You're not talking about a hegemon. And you're not talking about a hegemon and chief acolyte. You're talking about all of the countries of the European Union with shared values moving forward together. And what people in South America, Asia, elsewhere, when they look at the European Union and they're very positive, they want a region that could be exemplary in relation to rights, decent work, eliminating poverty, participating internationally in the best interests, if you like, of global security and that. Really, the idea that you somehow or another patch together a union as a kind of a complement to a set of fiscal arrangements isn't really sufficient to restore confidence. And I think that the conversation with the European street is the thing that has to be restored. You cannot abandon those who didn't participate in growth, those who didn't participate in income, and those who are unemployed, and particularly the young unemployed in so many of the states, and abandon them to a discourse that is xenophobic, potentially racist, and so on. That's why, in my speeches I've been mentioning about, in the same way as literacy was important to parliamentarism across Europe, the new fiscal and economic literacy, making this realm accountable and participatory by publics, is where you will in fact I've spoken to the European Parliament, to the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, and I said to them, if you allow these decisions to be leached out of Parliament and out of the parliamentary discourse onto the spaces where they will be abused, there will be a terrible price to be paid for it. And I totally agree with you, when people of your age and the rest of it, is you can make, Europe can in fact actually be that region. But so also can the other regions around the world in ways. But culture in the end, it's not a matter of what it's, I think if you asked us, those of us, small countries like us, I make many invitations to people to examine what I call the ethics of memory, unfolding Paul Ricoeur and Hannah Arendt and others like that. The hardest journey many people have is in relation to empire examining its conscience and tendencies to domination being made critical, and people examining the consequences. Do we need hegemons or do we need a peaceful world? and how much will have to be given away at the level of ideas and so on. Sometimes I actually think, I was thinking the other day, when I often have referred to gated communities, what would it be like if our world and the great cities like Auckland descended into a scene where you had gated communities of the rich and the people out on the street perceived as those who want what we have and won't give to them? And in the same way you could get gated conversations. In the international diplomacy, very often, we're getting gated conversations. That is, there are certain things which can't be raised with those who are perceived to be powerful. And that, in a way, is something that will have to change. That is what will give energy, once again, to the United Nations and its agencies.
All that we have time for today, but before they depart, the University of Auckland would like to present a gift of Toanga Pounamu to President Higgins and Mrs. Sabina Higgins. It's a tricky business, this, ladies and gentlemen. Ladies and gentlemen, just to give you a little bit of background on what just occurred. The toki is a symbol of chiefly dignity and mana authority. The toki were worn by Maori elders as a symbol of power and wisdom. The toki was a chisel tool used by the Maori people of Aotearoa, New Zealand, to carve their great canoes and carve detailing on their meeting houses. The koru is a spiral shape based on the shape of a new unfurling silver fern frond, symbolising new life, growth, strength and peace. It is an integral symbol in Māori art, carving and tattoos. Ladies and gentlemen, if I could ask you to just remain seated while the official party leaves the theatre, please join me in thanking the President of Ireland, Michael D. Higgins, and Mrs. Sabina Higgins.